The envelope arrived at Bumpy Johnson's home on a Tuesday morning. No return address. No postage. Just placed carefully on his doorstep overnight. Inside was a photograph. His daughter, Ruthie, walking home from school, taken 3 days earlier. And beneath the photo, 5 words written in crude letters. She's next unless you leave. Bumpy Johnson had faced death threats before, had survived assassination attempts, had outlasted enemies who thought they could intimidate him into submission. But this was different. This wasn't business. This was family. The men who sent that envelope made one catastrophic mistake. They thought threatening a child would make Bumpy afraid, would make him negotiate, would make him weak. Instead, it made him something far more dangerous. For 3 hours, Harlem held its breath. And when those 3 hours ended, 5 men wished they'd never heard the name Bumpy Johnson. This is the story of what happens when you cross the one line no one should ever cross. Harlem in 1960 was changing. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum. Young activists were organizing, demanding equality, challenging the systems that had kept Black Americans subordinate for centuries. But progress brought backlash. The Ku Klux Klan, which most people assumed had retreated to the South, was reorganizing in northern cities. They recruited in working-class white neighborhoods, held meetings in church basements and union halls, spread fear through intimidation and violence. Their message was simple: keep neighborhoods segregated, keep Black people in their place, resist integration by any means necessary. New York had active Klan cells in Queens, in Staten Island, even in parts of the Bronx. They operated carefully, avoided the attention that Southern chapters attracted, used coded language, worked through front organizations. But their methods were the same: threats, intimidation, occasional violence designed to terrify. Bumpy Johnson had been monitoring their activity for months. His informants reported meetings, tracked membership, noted when Klan organizers showed interest in Harlem. He'd dealt with white supremacists before. The 1936 attack on the Rhythm Room had taught him how to respond to organized hate. But that was business. Property. Replaceable. This was different. Ruthie Johnson was 15 years old. Smart. Ambitious. She wanted to be a lawyer. Wanted to fight injustice through the courts rather than the streets. Bumpy had made sure she got the best education available. Private school. Tutors. Everything he'd never had. She was his pride. His hope. His proof that the next generation could transcend the limitations he'd faced. She knew about her father's reputation. Knew he was more than the nightclub owner he claimed to be. But Bumpy had kept her separate from that world. Protected. Innocent. Clean. The Klan had been watching her for weeks. Following her route to school. Noting her schedule. Taking photographs. Building a file. They'd chosen her specifically because of who her father was. Because Bumpy Johnson represented everything they hated. A powerful Black man. Successful. Respected. Untouchable through normal means. So they went after what he loved. The envelope was delivered by a man named Robert Coleman. Klan organizer. 38 years old. Veteran of intimidation campaigns across 3 states. He'd perfected the art of threatening families. Of making people too afraid to resist. Of breaking strong men by targeting their children. Coleman and 4 associates had planned this carefully. The photograph. The message. The implied threat. They expected Bumpy to get scared. To maybe negotiate. To possibly even agree to their demands. Leave Harlem. Stop his operations. Disappear. They had no idea what they'd actually done. No idea that threatening Ruthie Johnson wasn't a strategy. It was a death sentence. Because Bumpy Johnson could tolerate many things. Disrespect to himself. Challenges to his business. Even attempts on his own life. But his daughter? That was the one line. The one boundary that, once crossed, erased all rules. All restraint. All mercy. When Bumpy opened that envelope at 9 o'clock Tuesday morning, something changed. The calculated gangster became something primal. Something infinitely more dangerous. He made 3 phone calls. Each under 2 minutes. Each to someone who owed him everything. By 9:15, the hunt had begun. Bumpy's first call was to Jericho. His most trusted lieutenant. The man who'd been with him for 20 years. Who understood that some situations required different rules. They threatened Ruthie, Bumpy said. His voice was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that preceded hurricanes. Jericho was silent for 3 seconds. Then, what do you need? Everything. Everyone. Now. Within 30 minutes, 15 men gathered at Bumpy's brownstone. Not just soldiers. Specialists. Men who knew how to extract information, how to track people who didn't want to be found, how to make examples that lasted generations. Bumpy stood in his office, the photograph of Ruthie on his desk, the envelope beside it. He didn't touch them again. Didn't need to. The image was burned into his mind. The Klan sent this, he said. No emotion, just facts. They've been watching my daughter, following her, taking pictures, threatening her. The room temperature dropped, because every man there understood. This wasn't business. This was family, and family was sacred. I want to know who delivered it, who took the photograph, who planned it, who gave the order. I want names, addresses, everything about them, their families, their jobs, their routines. He paused, looked at each man individually. And I want it in 3 hours. 3 hours. Not 3 days. Not a week. 3 hours to dismantle a Klan cell that had operated in shadows for months. It should have been impossible. But Bumpy had spent 30 years building a network. Informants in police departments. Sources in white neighborhoods. People who owed him favors they could never repay. All of it activated simultaneously. The second call had been to a detective named Morrison. Irish cop. Corrupt, but reliable. He'd been on Bumpy's payroll for a decade. I need Klan activity reports, Bumpy had said. Everything filed in the last 6 months. Meetings. Known members. Addresses. Morrison hesitated. That's federal information. FBI jurisdiction. If they find out 3 hours, Bumpy interrupted. Or I make sure everyone knows about the money you've been taking. The evidence you've buried. The crimes you've ignored. Morrison delivered the files in 45 minutes. Dropped them at a neutral location. Disappeared before anyone could connect him. The files contained everything. Names. Addresses. Organizational structure. The FBI had been monitoring the Klan but hadn't acted. Bureaucracy. Politics. The usual reasons justice delayed became justice denied. But Bumpy didn't need justice. He needed targets. The third call had been to someone unexpected. A white reporter named Sarah Mitchell. She'd covered organized crime for the Amsterdam News. Had written about Bumpy before. Fair articles. Balanced. Respectful. She owed him nothing. But she'd grown up in Harlem. Had black friends. Understood what the Klan represented. When Bumpy explained what happened, she didn't hesitate. I have a source. Former Klan member who left the organization. He might know who's operating in New York. She made the call. Got a name. Robert Coleman. Operating out of Queens. Recruiting in white neighborhoods. Specializing in intimidation campaigns. The source provided an address. A meeting location. Even described Coleman's car. Within 90 minutes of receiving the envelope, Bumpy had his target. But he didn't move immediately. Didn't rush. Because rushing meant mistakes. And mistakes meant Coleman might escape. Might warn others. Might disappear. Instead, Bumpy planned. Mapped Coleman's routine. Identified his associates. Found their vulnerabilities. Their families. Their secrets. If you're going to send a message, it has to be complete. Has to be so thorough that no one ever forgets. Has to make everyone who hears it understand the consequences of crossing certain lines. Ruthie was at school, unaware of the threat. Unaware that her father was orchestrating something that would become legend. Bumpy had assigned 4 men to watch her. Invisibly. She wouldn't know they were there. But anyone who got close would be identified. Tracked. Added to the list. At 11 o'clock, Bumpy's men located Robert Coleman. He was at a diner in Astoria, meeting with 2 associates, discussing their next target. Laughing. Confident. They had no idea they were being watched. Had no idea that across the street, in 3 different vehicles, men with cameras were documenting everything. License plates. Faces. The associates' identities were confirmed within minutes. John Reardon. Thomas Whitmore. Both Klan members. Both involved in the Ruthie photograph. Both about to learn what happened when you threatened the wrong family. Bumpy reviewed the intelligence. Saw the pattern. Coleman was the organizer. The planner. But there were 2 others. The photographer. And whoever gave the final approval. The man who said yes, target the daughter. That man was still unknown. But Coleman would provide that information. Bumpy was certain. Because everyone talks eventually. When properly motivated. At 11:30, Coleman left the diner. Drove toward his apartment in Jackson Heights. Alone. That was his mistake. Being predictable. Being comfortable. Thinking he was safe. 2 blocks from his building, a car pulled in front of him. Stopped suddenly. Coleman hit the brakes. Annoyed. Started to honk. Then he saw the men getting out. 4 of them, moving toward his car with purpose. He tried to reverse. Another car blocked him from behind. Trapped. Coleman reached for the gun in his glove compartment. Too slow. His door was yanked open. Hands grabbed him, pulled him out. Onto the street. One punch. Precisely placed. He went limp. 30 seconds. That's how long the abduction took. 30 seconds for Robert Coleman to go from confident Klan organizer to prisoner. He was placed in a trunk, driven to a warehouse in the Bronx. The same warehouse where Bumpy had conducted business for years, where problems were solved quietly, permanently. When Coleman woke up, he was tied to a chair. Single light overhead. Shadows everywhere. He couldn't see who else was in the room, but he could feel them, watching, waiting. Then Bumpy stepped into the light. Coleman's face went pale, because even Klan members knew the name, knew the reputation, knew what it meant when Bumpy Johnson took personal interest. "You sent me something this morning," Bumpy said quietly. "A photograph of my daughter." Coleman tried to speak. His mouth was dry. Words wouldn't come. "I want to know everything," Bumpy continued. "Who planned it? Who took the picture? Who approved it? Who else is involved? You're going to tell me. All of it." Coleman shook his head. I can't." Bumpy gestured. Someone stepped forward from the shadows. Jericho, holding tools that Coleman recognized. That made his stomach drop. "You have 2 choices," Bumpy said. "Talk now. Quickly. Completely. Or talk later. After we've spent time together. Your choice." Coleman looked at Bumpy's face. Saw no mercy there. No negotiation. Just certainty. Just the absolute knowledge that this would end only one way. He talked. Gave names. Addresses. The entire operation. Who took the photograph? Who delivered the envelope? And most importantly, who gave the order? A man named Eugene Kramer, Klan leader for the New York region, operating out of Staten Island. He'd approved the Ruthie threat personally. Thought it would break Bumpy. Thought it would show other black leaders what happened when they got too powerful. It was 12:30. 90 minutes left in Bumpy's 3-hour deadline. Enough time to finish this properly. Eugene Kramer lived in a house on Staten Island. Quiet neighborhood. Tree-lined street. The kind of place where no one suspected the resident was organizing racial terror campaigns. He was 53 years old. Insurance salesman by day. Grand Dragon by night. He'd been in the Klan for 20 years. Started in Georgia. Moved north when the FBI pressure got too intense down south. He thought New York would be easier. Thought Northern Klan operations could be more subtle. More effective. He was home when Bumpy's men arrived. 1:15 in the afternoon. His wife had gone shopping. His kids were at school. He was alone, reviewing membership lists, planning the next intimidation campaign. The front door opened. He hadn't heard it. Hadn't heard the lock picked. Hadn't heard 4 men enter his house. By the time he looked up, they were already in his office. Kramer reached for the drawer. For the gun he kept there. "Don't," one of them said. "Willie, Bumpy's enforcer." The gun was already pointed at Kramer's head. Kramer froze. Calculations running through his mind. Who were these men? What did they want? How did they find him? "Bumpy Johnson wants to see you," Willie said. 3 words that answered every question. Kramer's face went white. "I don't know any. Save it. You got 10 seconds to stand up. Walk out with us quietly, or we carry you out. Either way, you're coming." Kramer stood. His legs shook. His hands trembled. He'd sent threats to dozens of people. Had terrorized families. Had ruined lives. But he'd never been on the receiving end. Never understood what it felt like. The fear. The helplessness. The certainty that your life was no longer your own. They walked him out. Put him in a car. Drove to the Bronx. To the warehouse. Where Coleman was still tied to his chair. Still bleeding from where Jericho had encouraged his cooperation. When Kramer saw Coleman, he understood. The operation was compromised. Everything he'd built was exposed. And Bumpy Johnson knew all of it. Bumpy was waiting. He didn't speak immediately. Just looked at Kramer. Let the silence build. Let the fear grow. Let Kramer imagine every possible outcome. "You approved a threat against my daughter," Bumpy finally said. Statement. Not question. Kramer tried to find words. Some explanation that would make this survivable. It was just, "We were trying to send a message. About boundaries. About terrorizing a 15-year-old girl," Bumpy interrupted. His voice was still quiet. Still controlled. But underneath was something volcanic. Something barely contained. Kramer swallowed. "We weren't going to actually hurt her. It was just intimidation. Just. Bumpy stepped closer. You followed my daughter. Photographed her. Threatened her life. And you're telling me it was just intimidation. He was inches from Kramer's face now. You have children. 3 of them. I know where they go to school. Know their routes home. Know everywhere they go. Should I send you photographs? Should I threaten them? Would that be just intimidation? Kramer's eyes widened. You wouldn't. They're innocent. They didn't, and Ruthie did. Bumpy's voice rose for the first time. What did my daughter do to deserve your attention? What crime did she commit except being born black? Except having a father you couldn't control? The warehouse was silent. Coleman watched from his chair. Kramer stood frozen. Both men understanding they'd made an error beyond calculation. Here's what's going to happen, Bumpy said. He was calm again, but it was the calm of a judge delivering sentence. Not mercy, just finality. You're going to disband your organization. Every cell, every member, everyone who participated in this. They're done. Finished. Gone from New York. Kramer started to protest. I can't just. You can. You will. Because the alternative is worse. Bumpy gestured to Jericho, who handed him a folder. Documents. Photographs. Evidence. This is everything. Every member of your organization. Every meeting location. Every illegal activity. Every connection to violence. I've got copies going to the FBI, the NYPD, and the press, all ready to be delivered. He paused. Let that sink in. Unless you disappear. Today. Take your family. Leave New York. Never come back. Tell your members the same thing. Scatter. Retire. Find new hobbies. Because if I ever hear about Klan activity in this city again, if I ever see another threat, another photograph, another hint that someone thinks they can terrorize black families, all of this goes public, and I make sure every agency knows you were warned, that you had a chance, that you chose to continue. Kramer's mind raced. Federal charges. Prison time. His family exposed. His life destroyed. Versus exile. Starting over. Losing everything he'd built, but keeping his freedom. And them? Kramer asked, gesturing to Coleman. To the other associates Bumpy's men had rounded up. They come with you. Or they don't. That's between you and them. But they're leaving New York. Today. All of them. It was 1:45. Bumpy's 3-hour deadline was almost up. But he had one more move. One final message. Before you go, he said, you're going to write something. A confession. Admitting what you did. Admitting you targeted my daughter. Admitting your organization's activities. Signing your name. Kramer hesitated. That's evidence. That could be used, exactly. Insurance. To make sure you never forget. To make sure you never come back. To make sure if you ever think about resuming operations, I have something that destroys you completely. Kramer wrote. Hand shaking. Every word an admission of guilt. Every sentence another chain binding him. When he finished, Bumpy took the document. Read it. Nodded. Good. Now get out of my city. You've got until sunset. After that, my people start looking for you. And if they find you, there won't be another conversation. Kramer and Coleman were released. Driven to separate locations. Dropped off with nothing but instructions. Leave. Never return. Tell everyone what happened. Make sure the story spreads. By 2:30, both men were packing. By 4 o'clock, they were gone. Coleman to Boston. Kramer to Florida. Both carrying the memory of 3 hours that changed everything. Both understanding they'd been given something rare. A second chance. But Bumpy wasn't done. Because the message wasn't just for the Klan members he'd caught. It was for everyone. Every white supremacist. Every racist organization. Every person who thought black families were acceptable targets. At 2:45, exactly 3 hours after receiving the envelope, Bumpy made one final call. To every contact. Every informant. Every person in his network. The message was simple. Spread the story. Tell everyone what happened. Make sure every Klan member, every sympathizer, every person who'd ever considered racial terrorism, make sure they all heard. About the photograph. About the 3-hour response. About what Bumpy Johnson did when someone threatened his daughter. The story spread like fire. By evening, every organized hate group in New York knew. By the next day, word had reached New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Connecticut. Within a week, the story was legend. And the Klan's northern recruitment collapsed. Because potential members heard what happened. Heard about men who were tracked, captured, broken, exiled, all in 3 hours. Heard what awaited anyone who thought targeting families was strategy. 3 o'clock arrived. Bumpy's deadline had passed. The warehouse in the Bronx was empty now. Coleman and Kramer were gone, fleeing the city, running from consequences they'd never imagined. But Bumpy wasn't satisfied. Not yet, because exile wasn't enough. The message had to be complete, had to be so clear, so undeniable, that no one would ever make the same mistake. He returned home, to the brownstone where the envelope had been delivered, where this had all started 6 hours earlier. Ruthie was already there, home from school, safe, protected by men she'd never seen. She was in the kitchen, doing homework, completely unaware of what had transpired, unaware that 5 men had been hunted, captured, broken, exiled, all because of a photograph. Bumpy stood in the doorway, watched her for a moment. She looked up, smiled. "Hey, Daddy, you're home early." He walked over, kissed her forehead. "Just wanted to see you." She went back to her homework. Math problems, simple teenage concerns, the kind of innocence Bumpy had fought his entire life to protect. He went to his office, sat down. The photograph was still on his desk. He picked it up, looked at it one final time. Then he burned it, watched the edges curl, watched his daughter's image disappear into ash, watched the threat become nothing. But he kept the envelope, kept Coleman's confession, kept Kramer's signed admission, insurance, evidence, proof that this had happened, that the line had been crossed, that justice had been delivered. At 4 o'clock, the phone rang. Frank Costello, the Italian mob boss who'd become Bumpy's unlikely ally. "Heard about this morning," Costello said. "Heard what you did about it." Bumpy said nothing. Waited. "That was the right move," Costello continued. "Clean. Efficient. No bodies. No heat. Just problem solved. The families respect that." It was approval, from the highest levels of organized crime. Recognition that Bumpy had handled a crisis perfectly. "They threatened Ruthie," Bumpy said. Simply. Then they got what they deserved. And they got off light. There was a pause. Then Costello added something unexpected. "You know, the Klan's been trying to recruit Italian neighborhoods. Been approaching our people. Making alliances. We don't tolerate that. What you did today, that helps everyone." It was bigger than Bumpy realized. The Klan hadn't just been targeting black families. They'd been building infrastructure, creating networks, threatening the established order. By dismantling their operation, Bumpy had solved a problem that extended beyond Harlem, had protected more than just his daughter, had struck a blow against organized hate that benefited everyone. At 5 o'clock, the final piece fell into place. A reporter from the Amsterdam News called. Sarah Mitchell, the woman who'd provided the initial lead. "The story's out," she said. "About what happened today. About the threat. About your response. It's spreading everywhere." Bumpy had expected this. Had wanted it. "Good. Let it spread. People are calling you a hero," Sarah continued. "Saying you stood up to the Klan. Saying you protected not just your daughter, but every black family in New York." Bumpy didn't feel like a hero. Felt like a father who'd done what any father would do. What any father should do. Protect their child. At any cost. "I'm writing the story," Sarah said. "But I wanted to ask, do you want to comment?" Officially, Bumpy thought about that. About going public. About confirming what everyone already knew. "No comment," he finally said. "Let the story speak for itself." Because the story was enough. The facts. The timeline. The 3-hour response that had dismantled a hate organization. That had sent a message so clear, so powerful, that it would echo for decades. Sarah understood. One more thing. The Klan. They're finished in New York. Word is their national leadership is pulling out. Cutting losses. They can't recruit here anymore. Not after this. That was the real victory. Not just saving Ruthie. Not just punishing the men responsible. But creating consequences so severe that the entire organization retreated. That night, Bumpy sat with his family. Ruthie. His wife Mamie. Normal dinner. Normal conversation. Ruthie talked about school. About college applications. About her future. She had no idea that her future had been threatened. Had been protected. Had been secured through 3 hours of calculated violence that would become legend. After dinner, Bumpy returned to his office. Sat in the darkness. Thought about the day. About the photograph. About the fear he'd felt seeing his daughter's image in that envelope. About the rage that had driven everything that followed. He'd built an empire through intelligence. Through strategy. Through being smarter than everyone else. But today had been different. Today had been primal. Had been about something deeper than business. Deeper than power. About family. About protection. About the things that mattered more than anything else. The 3 hours hadn't just been about efficiency, about sending messages. They'd been about demonstrating that some lines were absolute, that threatening children brought consequences beyond calculation, that there were forces in the world more dangerous than organized hate, forces like a father's love and a father's rage. The next morning, Bumpy received confirmation. All 5 Klan members had left New York. Coleman was in Boston, Kramer in Miami. The photographer, a man named Harris, had gone to Chicago. The other 2 associates had scattered to different cities. None would return. His informants reported something else. Klan meeting locations across New York were empty, abandoned. The organization's infrastructure was collapsing. Members were quitting, distancing themselves, destroying evidence of their involvement. 3 hours had accomplished what years of law enforcement couldn't, had dismantled a hate network through fear and precision. But the real test came that afternoon. Ruthie walked home from school. Same route, same time. Bumpy's men watched from a distance, ready for anything. Nothing happened. No followers. No cars watching. No photographers lurking. The threat was gone. Completely. Bumpy met her at the door. She noticed something different in his expression. Relief. Tension releasing. "Everything okay, Daddy?" she asked. He smiled. Genuine this time. "Everything's fine, baby. Everything's fine." That evening, word reached Bumpy through unexpected channels. The FBI had been monitoring the Klan cell, had files on Coleman and Kramer, but hadn't acted. Bureaucracy. Politics. The usual excuses. Now their targets had fled. Their investigation was dead. An agent named Morrison, different from the corrupt cop, called Bumpy. Unofficial conversation. "You did what we couldn't," Morrison said. "Got results we'd been trying to achieve for months. Officially, I can't acknowledge that. Unofficially, good work." It was surreal. Federal law enforcement thanking a gangster for solving their problem. But that's how things worked in the real world, where justice often came from unexpected sources. In Harlem, the reaction was celebration. Quiet but profound. People who'd heard whispers of the threat, who'd learned about the response. They understood what it meant. That Bumpy Johnson protected more than his own interests. Protected the community. Protected families. Protected children. Mothers who'd been afraid started feeling safer. Fathers who'd worried about their kids walking home relaxed slightly. Because the message was clear. Touch Harlem's children and face consequences beyond imagination. The story reached other cities. Other communities facing Klan intimidation. And it gave them something they'd been lacking. Hope. Proof that organized hate could be beaten, could be dismantled, could be made to retreat. Within 2 weeks, Klan activity across the Northeast dropped dramatically. Recruitment failed. Operations stalled. The organization that had seemed unstoppable was suddenly vulnerable. All because of 3 hours. 3 hours when Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated what happened when someone threatened what he loved most. But there was a cost. Not visible, not obvious, but real. Bumpy had crossed lines even he'd avoided before. Had used his entire network for personal reasons. Had made enemies of people who might have otherwise remained neutral. Some in law enforcement who tolerated him now saw him as too powerful, too capable, too dangerous. The FBI opened a new file. Not about his criminal activities. About his influence. His reach. His ability to accomplish in hours what took them months. They started watching closer. Planning. Building cases. It would take years. But the seeds were planted that day. The seeds of Bumpy's eventual legal troubles. Of investigations that would dog him for the rest of his life. But in that moment, none of that mattered. His daughter was safe. The threat was eliminated. The message was sent. Everything else was tomorrow's problem. Mamie found him that evening, standing at the window, looking out at Harlem, at the streets he'd protected for decades. "You did good," she said quietly. Bumpy nodded. But his expression was complicated. "I did what I had to." That photograph. Seeing Ruthie like that. "I've never seen you that way before." What way? Afraid. He didn't deny it. They knew exactly what to target. Exactly how to hurt me. If they'd been smarter. If they'd actually gone through with it. He didn't finish. Couldn't finish. Mamie put her hand on his shoulder. "But they didn't. And they won't. Because you made sure. You protected our daughter. That's all that matters." She was right. The what-ifs didn't matter. The possibilities didn't matter. What mattered was the result. Ruthie was safe. Would continue being safe. Would grow up. Become a lawyer. Fight injustice in courts instead of streets. Would never know how close she'd come. How 3 hours had changed everything. That night, Bumpy slept better than he had in days. The tension released. The fear subsided. But part of him remained vigilant. Always watching. Always waiting. Because he understood something fundamental about the world. About evil. About hate. It never truly disappeared. Just retreated. Regrouped. Waited for another opportunity. And when it came back, he'd be ready. Would respond the same way. With intelligence. With precision. With the absolute certainty that threatening his family meant facing consequences beyond mercy. The 3 hours became legend. But for Bumpy, they were just another day. Another crisis. Another line defended. Another reminder that in his world, in the world he'd built, family came first. Always. No matter what. No matter who. No matter the cost. The weeks following the 3-hour response brought unexpected changes. The Klan's northern operations never recovered. Their recruitment collapsed. Their infrastructure disappeared. Members who remained went underground. Silent. Invisible. Afraid. In Harlem, parents walked their children to school with less fear. Teenagers moved through neighborhoods with more confidence. The invisible threat that had been building, the sense that hate was organizing and growing, evaporated. Bumpy continued his operations. Numbers. Clubs. The usual business. But something had shifted. His reputation had evolved. He wasn't just Harlem's protector anymore. He was the man who'd defended a child, who'd faced down organized hate, who'd won in 3 hours. Young fathers sought his advice, asked how he'd done it, how he'd moved so quickly, how he'd dismantled an organization that had seemed untouchable. Bumpy's answer was always the same: preparation, information, and knowing what matters most. The Italian mob families noticed the shift, saw how Bumpy's influence had grown, how his network had performed under pressure. Frank Costello invited him to another dinner. More private this time. More personal. What you did with the Klan situation, Costello said over wine. That demonstrated something important. Control. Precision. The ability to solve problems without creating bigger ones. Bumpy waited. There was more coming. The commission has been discussing expansion. New partnerships. New arrangements. Your name came up. As someone who could be useful in situations requiring discretion. It was an offer. Not explicit, but clear. Deeper integration with the Italian families. More cooperation. More shared operations. More power. But also more exposure. More risk. More entanglement with organizations that drew federal attention. Bumpy considered carefully. I appreciate the consideration. But Harlem's enough for me. Always has been. Costello nodded. Expected that answer. Respected it. If you change your mind. The door's open. They never spoke of it again. But the offer existed. Waiting. A path to greater power if Bumpy ever wanted it. He never did. Because the 3 hours had reminded him what mattered. Not empire. Not influence. Family. Community. The ability to protect what was his. Meanwhile, Robert Coleman never recovered. He tried to rebuild in Boston. Start fresh. But the story followed him. People knew what he'd done. Knew what had happened. Knew he'd been broken and exiled. He couldn't recruit. Couldn't organize. Couldn't escape the reputation of being the man who'd crossed Bumpy Johnson and lost everything. He left the Klan. Moved to California. Took a job in construction. Lived quietly. Died in 1979 of a heart attack. Never speaking about that day. Never explaining to his family why he'd fled New York so suddenly. Eugene Kramer fared slightly better. Opened a small business in Florida. Stayed away from organized hate. But he never forgot the warehouse. Never forgot the certainty in Bumpy's voice. The knowledge that he'd been given mercy he didn't deserve. He kept Bumpy's photograph on his desk. Not Ruthie's. A photo clipped from a newspaper. A reminder of what happened when you crossed certain lines. Of what real power looked like. His children asked about it once. He told them it was a business associate. They never asked again. The FBI's increased scrutiny of Bumpy began slowly. New surveillance. New wiretaps. New agents assigned to build cases. They couldn't touch him for the Klan situation. No laws broken that they could prove. No violence they could document. Just efficient problem-solving that happened to involve organized crime methods. But they watched. Waited. Gathered information for future prosecutions. It would eventually lead to arrests. To trials. To complications that defined Bumpy's later years. But that was still ahead. For now, life continued. Ruthie graduated high school in 1963. Top of her class. Got accepted to Howard University. Decided to study law just like she'd always planned. At her graduation, Bumpy sat in the audience, watching his daughter receive awards, listening to her acceptance speech, seeing her future unfold exactly as he'd hoped. She never knew about the photograph, about the threat, about the 3 hours that had protected her future. Bumpy made sure. Mamie knew. His inner circle knew. But Ruthie lived in innocence, the way it should be. After the ceremony, she hugged him. "Thank you, Daddy, for everything, for making this possible." He held her tight. "You did this yourself, baby. I just made sure nobody got in your way." It was true and untrue. She'd earned her success through hard work, through intelligence, through dedication. But Bumpy had cleared the obstacles, had eliminated the threats, had created space for her to thrive. That night, alone in his office, Bumpy thought about legacy, about what he'd leave behind. The empire would fade, the money would disappear, the power would transfer to others. But Ruthie, her education, her career, her future, that was permanent, that was real, that was worth more than anything else he'd accomplished. By 1968, 8 years after the envelope arrived, the world had changed. The Civil Rights Act had passed. Voting rights were protected. Malcolm X had been assassinated. Martin Luther King Jr. would be killed that April. America was transforming through pain and progress. The Klan still existed, still operated in pockets across the country, but their power had diminished. Their influence had weakened. Part of that was the movement, the activists, the lawyers, the people fighting through legitimate channels. But part of it was fear. Fear planted by stories like Bumpy's. Stories that demonstrated resistance had teeth, that threatening black families brought consequences, that organized hate could be dismantled by organized intelligence. Bumpy Johnson died that July. Heart attack on a Harlem street. He was 62 years old. His funeral was massive. Politicians came, musicians, business owners, and criminals from every organization, paying respects to a man who'd changed the game. Ruthie spoke at the service. She was 23, already in law school, already building the career he'd protected. "My father taught me that justice doesn't always come from courtrooms," she said. Her voice steady, strong. "Sometimes it comes from people willing to stand up, to protect, to fight for what's right even when the system fails." She didn't know the full story, didn't know about Coleman or Kramer, didn't know about the 3 hours. But she understood the principle, the lesson, that some things were worth fighting for, worth defending, worth any cost. After the funeral, Jericho found Mamie, handed her an envelope. Inside was the confession, Coleman's signed statement, Kramer's admission, all the evidence Bumpy had kept. "He wanted you to have this," Jericho said. "Said if anything happened to him, you should decide what to do with it." Mamie read the documents, saw her daughter's name, saw the threat, saw the response. She'd known about it, of course, had lived through it, but seeing it written, official, permanent, it hit differently. She burned the documents that night, watched them turn to ash, just like Bumpy had burned the photograph. Some stories didn't need documentation. Some victories didn't need proof. They just needed to be remembered. The legend of the 3 hours spread through generations. Parents told children. Teachers told students. People who'd never met Bumpy Johnson knew the story. About the envelope, about the threat, about the response that dismantled hate in an afternoon. It became more than history. It became instruction, a lesson about standing up to evil, about protecting the vulnerable, about refusing to accept intimidation as inevitable. In 1985, a young man named Barack Obama moved to Chicago, started organizing communities, fighting for justice. Someone told him the Bumpy Johnson story, about intelligence defeating hate, about preparation creating opportunities, about defending what mattered. Years later, he'd tell interviewers that stories like that shaped his understanding of power, of how change actually happened, not always through official channels, sometimes through people willing to do what needed doing. The Klan never fully recovered in northern cities. They'd reorganize periodically, try new strategies, new names, new approaches, but the fear remained. The memory of organizations that had been dismantled, of leaders who'd been exiled, of consequences that came swiftly and completely. Ruthie Johnson became a civil rights attorney, argued cases before the Supreme Court, defended voting rights, protected communities from discrimination. She dedicated her career to using law to accomplish what her father had done through other means. Justice, protection, defense of the vulnerable. She died in 2019, 94 years old. surrounded by grandchildren who'd never known poverty, never known segregation, never known the fear that had defined earlier generations. At her funeral, someone mentioned the photograph, the threat from 1960. She'd learned about it eventually, years after Bumpy died. Mamie had told her, explained what had happened, what her father had done. Ruthie's response had been simple. He did what any parent would do, what every parent should do, protected his child. That became her legacy, not just her legal career, not just her victories in court, but the understanding that protection matters, that standing up to hate matters, that refusing to accept evil matters. The 3 hours lived on, not in documents, not in official records, but in memory, in story, in the lessons passed down through generations. About a father who'd received a threat, who'd responded with precision, who'd dismantled organized hate before lunch, who'd sent a message that echoed for decades. Some people measure power in money, others in territory, others in violence. Bumpy Johnson measured it differently, in the ability to protect what mattered most, in the capacity to eliminate threats before they materialized, in the knowledge that when someone crossed the line, consequences came swiftly and completely. That's what the 3 hours really proved. Not that Bumpy was ruthless, not that he was powerful, but that he understood priorities, understood what mattered, understood that everything else, all the empire and influence and reputation, meant nothing if he couldn't protect his daughter. The envelope that arrived that Tuesday morning had been intended to break him, to make him afraid, to force him into submission. Instead, it revealed something the Klan never understood, that threatening what a man loves most doesn't make him weak. It makes him unstoppable. Bumpy Johnson was already dangerous, already strategic, already respected. But that photograph of Ruthie transformed him into something else, something the Klan couldn't comprehend. A force driven not by ambition, but by love. And love, properly motivated, properly directed, was the most dangerous force in the world.